I'm Julia Cumberledge. I was invited by the previous Secretary of State to do this review before he chose to leave, but there you go. And on my left is Sir Cyril Chancellor, who I'm sure you know, and he's the Vice Chairman of the review. And the third member of our panel is Simon Whale, and Simon particularly looks at communications and information and that side of things. On Simon's right is Dr. Valerie Brass, and Valerie is our secretary. And on Cyril's left is Dr. Sonia MacLeod, who is our senior researcher. And then we've got other people in the room who are just helping us run the session, as it were. And so we are recording this, and I hope you appreciate that. And it will go onto our website, so people will be able to see what has happened during the session. And it was our fundamental purpose to ensure that everybody knew what we were at, that nothing was hidden, and people could understand where we got to in terms of the review. And one of the issues that came through when we met a lot of patients was that they thought that they weren't being listened to, they weren't trusted, and they really felt that they should be taken more seriously. So that was why we are open, transparent, and have a very important communication channel with them, particularly the patient groups. So we'll now record so that people will know who you are and what you're doing. So, Professor, would you like to start?
I wish I'd never said anything. So my name is Professor Colin Melville. I'm Medical Director and Director of Education and Standards at the GMC. I am a registered medical practitioner with a license to practice. I used to be an intensive care consultant, a role which I actually gave up when I took on this role in January 2017.
Thank you very much.
I'm Anthony Omo. I'm Director of Fitness to Practice at the GMC and also General Counsel, which means I look after all legal matters for the GMC.
Right, thank you very much indeed. As I was saying, one of the issues when we were going around the country and we were listening to a lot of patients, they were really very concerned about the consenting process, that when they were going to be operated on, etc., or even, and especially when they were taking medications, they really weren't fully informed of the consequences of either the operation or of the medications. And so we were very concerned by that, and we wondered really whether that's something that's come across your desks, how the consenting process is deemed to be by those who are having to use it in terms of give their consent, that the thought was it is inadequate. And we just wondered, have you thought about that, and if so, have you any measures to improve it?
So I think the first point that you made is that consent is a process, and we would absolutely affirm that. So we do have guidance on consent. It's quite extensive. We have actually recently gone out to consultation to see whether there should be any changes to the guidance we provide. That only recently closed, so I'm not in a position at the moment to be able to tell you where we've got to with that, but we can certainly provide updated information later. We used, in terms of communicating, we had one of the highest responses we've had to any consultation, and interestingly, and I think helpfully, a good response from members of the public. So we have very much got their view as well as those of professions and organisations. And we launched it on social media with the hashtag Deciding Together. And what we're trying to convey is that consent is not about a moment in time when you sign a form. It is about a conversation. It is about presenting the information in a way that a patient can understand so that they can make an informed decision. I don't think we would say that there is anything fundamentally wrong with the guidance. It's about how that guidance is being used in practice. I think there are some areas of practice where people perceive a greater clarity, so surgical operations where there is something in writing and something is signed, but on the issues of more general care and on prescribing, people probably don't think about it in the same way, even though it should be part of consent. In other words, consent is not just a process of signing something, it is a conversation which leads to shared decisions, whether they reach the threshold of needing signature or not.
So you've been doing some research on this. What has that shown up? Have you received the sort of information that we have from patients that actually they feel the consent process isn't good enough, isn't strong enough? And you're quite right, it's not really about signing forms, it's about the way the information is given. It even goes to body language. We've heard women say that the conversation when they took their partner, husband or partner, the conversation was between the surgeon and the partner, and the surgeon never looked at the woman and expected all the answers to come from the other male that was in the room.
I mean, clearly that's disappointing. I wouldn't ever begin to defend that, either as a professional clinician or as a member of the GMC. That isn't what our guidance sets out. I think the difficulty here is the translation between, or the interpretation perhaps, between what the guidance expects and how it's actually delivered on the ground. And that is partly around how medical students and doctors are educated. Consent features very strongly in that process, but that doesn't help to answer individual doctors who you've obviously heard about, where that is not seeming to meet what would be a reasonable standard of effectively communication rather than anything else, and being compassionate and empathic towards the patient.
So I'm very impressed what you were doing on Twitter, which is #decidingtogether. But have you used other mechanisms to get feedback from patients?
Yeah, sorry, I only use that as an example, really, to try and illustrate that what we're saying is that consent is not, as a doctor, I tell you what I'm going to do and you agree or disagree. It is about a conversation. It's about presenting the information that will help the patient to make an informed choice. So it was only for that reason. We used a number of avenues through our consultation, including engagement with some specific, I was going to call them public bodies, patient representative bodies, so that we could hear that. And we had a very good response. As I said, my team haven't analysed it yet, so I don't have that information, but there was a general support both from the profession and from the public for the changes that were in that guidance, which in many ways were more to try and tease out some of the smaller issues rather than the actual headlines of what the guidance says.
Because a conversation is between two people and both parties have views,
yes,
and
indeed,
should be free to express them.
Yes.
But one of the suggestions we've had is that there could be an audio record of that conversation, so that the patient, having heard what the clinician has been telling them, could take that away and discuss it with their family and then come back, because there may be a lot of questions that they would have asked if they'd had more time to think about it. I just wondered if you had any views on that sort of an improvement.
I don't think I have a specific view on audio recording, but there clearly needs to be a mechanism that the patient can take something away that in some measure summarises and allows the patient to come back and have further conversation or to seek clarification. I think the other point is that consent is not a once for all decision. Consent can be changed or withdrawn at any point. That might be something about patient public education as well as the profession, to understand that just because on one day a patient made one decision doesn't mean that the following day they might have a different view.
Right, well, thank you very much. We might come back to that. Simon.
Well, can I just to pick up on something about consent? So thank you for supplying various data to us. That's been really helpful. Just looking at cases that come to you that involve consent, I'm looking at your numbers. 2018, total of 120 cases, I believe, but 84 out of the 120 were either no further action before investigation or closed during investigation. It's quite a significant proportion that didn't get beyond that stage. Is there any comment you'd like to make about that?
So, yeah, I mean, obviously concerned with what we're hearing, which is not good practice in any stretch. And so we do take action when we get consents in, as the figures show. So we have an investigatory process which has statutory thresholds, and so it has to hit the threshold before we can investigate and then take action. So it's difficult for me to say in those individual cases what happened, but what generally happens is consent will be wrapped up with other issues. And the more serious it is and the assessment of the risk the doctor poses to future patients, we would be more willing to take action, more able to take action. If the consent is a communication problem, rather than, and there's no other concerns about the doctor's practice, then they could get advice or a warning, which is before we actually get to a tribunal. So there's a variety of things in there around consent. We take it quite seriously, but the mechanism we have for taking action rely on what is quite a legal test, the fitness to practice of the doctor going forward, as opposed to what they've done in the past, and that presents certain challenges for us. But we would investigate any consent that, of the nature you've described, where patients, and particularly the example of the patient not actually being spoken to and their partner being spoken to, I mean, that's just unacceptable, and we would look at that.
Can I just follow that up? So if the substantive allegation doesn't hit the threshold, but there is an issue around consent that's part and parcel of the whole, is it the threshold applied to the substantive bit, i.e. the quality of the treatment or whatever? And then what happens if you're getting these tagged on bits concerning the consent element? So you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Does the whole thing just get pushed out because it didn't meet the substantive threshold? No.
So the threshold applies across the complaint. So we're a creature of statute. In the Medical Act, it sets out 5 bases upon which we can take action. The fitness practice can only be impaired by reason of misconduct, serious deficient performance, the adverse health, a determination by another body, or language. Consent will be part of a misconduct or a performance allegation. So the doctor was rude, didn't do proper consent, and then prescribed the wrong medication, for example, could come in as a consent. We would look at all of that and consider whether the doctor, as a result of that, is still fit to practice or presents a risk to future patients. So we do look at all elements of the complaint, not a single one.
Could I just turn back to consent for a moment? The essence of good medical practice, I remember it, and I was once responsible for it, is that this is guidance, and you have to use your judgment. If you choose not to follow the guidance, then you have to be able to justify it if you're criticised, and that then can become a fitness to practice process. Correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Now, we were told last time we met to discuss this that an issue was that one person said one thing and somebody said another, and what happens behind closed doors, you can't determine that, and specifically we were told that. And so at that point, isn't it perhaps important to ensure, by whatever means you use, that the process of consent has been documented? And would you be saying that, do you think, and do you say that now in your guidance, that the process has to be adequately documented so that it's not just a question of what happened behind closed doors of what the doctor said or didn't say?
Absolutely. So the process should be documented. I think there's always been some confusion about what gets written in what we call the medical notes versus what's on the consent form.
Yes.
The matter is it appropriately recorded? But I think to the Baroness's point is how then is what has been documented shared with the patient,
yes,
in a way that allows them to say, well, is that your recollection of what we discussed? Because I'm assuming that part of this is the recall or different interpretations of what has been said and what it might have meant. So it's not just that it should be documented. Good practice would suggest, although I don't think we say that specifically, that actually it should be shared with the patient in a way that allows them to go.
I think I'm asking whether, given where we are now, because it has changed since I was on the medical register, and Montgomery, whether you need to be more specific in saying how this needs to be documented, so that if a complaint is made, it can be properly examined. And if that is not properly documented, where that in itself would be an issue where the practitioner had to justify that they hadn't followed the guidance.
Yes, so it's back to your point about professional judgment as well, isn't it? About the extent of the detail of what is documented, how it is documented. But the principle is right, that there should be some record of what has been discussed and what was agreed. That should be open and shared.
And if it's not there, then you'd have to justify the fact that it's not there because there was some immediate urgency that didn't allow that process or something like that.
Yes, it's back to the question of, if you're looking, absence of evidence is unhelpful in every respect, isn't it?
Well, the crucial. Sorry.
So you would, when the outcome of the consultation is known, you would consider, if necessary, changing the guidance in good medical practice regarding.
More than happy to have a look at that. I don't have that guidance in my head, but I would be reasonably confident that is covered in the guidance. I would be surprised if it isn't. But we will have a look.
That
at
didn't actually come out of our last session. That's why I raised it.
And just while you're on it, just to correct something, it is absolutely not the case where there's a dispute of evidence that we don't take action. In fact, if there is a dispute, we don't resolve it without a hearing. So those cases are more likely to go to a hearing.
Oh, right.
Because we are not allowed to resolve disputes without a hearing. So if that was put forward, I'm sorry about that, but that was not quite. That's not quite correct.
Thank you.
Can I just clarify? I'll go back to one point that Professor Melville made about consent and the recording of the process. So yes, there should be a documented audit trail, if you like, of the process. Presumably, what you're saying also, I think you're saying, is that the patient needs to be a co-owner of that record. It's not just that the doctor writes it down and files it away, but the patient has to see that and say, yes, that's how I recollect it too.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that.
Have you got any indication of how often that doesn't happen?
I don't, because in the sense that if it doesn't happen, we would only know about it if, having not happened, someone had enough concern to raise it with us. So it's possible that it hasn't happened, but no one's challenged it. And clearly you're hearing examples where that's not the case. Yes, sorry.
But are we talking, if you go in for surgery, you get a copy of the consent form?
Yes, but back to the process. So the discussion about what the choices are, so surgery or different types of surgery versus no treatment, delayed treatment, should all be part of that process. The conclusion of that conversation, in agreement with the patient, would be recorded on the consent form, which the patient would sign. But we don't mandate that the only source of information relating to consent is on the form, because there should be a record of the conversation, the clinic appointments, the visit, the discussions, any telephone calls. That should all be in the medical notes as well. So it's
And do
the two
patients
parts.
have those?
No, I think that's the point that the Baroness was raising, that although many doctors now, and there was a recent activity around this, wasn't it, writing the letter to the patient, not to the GP, I think that's a very interesting perspective. It takes away this sort of short-cutting medical language, which is probably helpful. So any communication should also include the nature of the conversation and some of the risks and opportunities that were discussed in that, and give the patient the right to come back and seek further information.
So as part of your sort of guidance on consent, are you looking at producing patient resources like patient decision aids, things like
Yes.
that?
No, we are. We always look at how can we help the patients to understand the advice that we're giving to doctors.
Can I just broaden out the discussion more generally? So, you've, as I've said, you sent us quite a lot of data about fitness to practice, which has been really helpful. One of the things that struck us was the relatively small proportion of FTP complaints that are investigated every year. Why is it such a small proportion that are investigated?
So there are a number of reasons why there's a small proportion. So we've received, certainly for the last 5 years, around about 9,000 complaints come through the door. Roughly about 6,000, and sometimes not about a doctor. They're about private disputes, parking disputes, and things like that. So they're not matters that would ever impact a doctor's clinical practice. They're not about clinical. And so we close those down or refer them to other regulators. We receive complaints about nurses, dentists, and that. We then investigate the balance. A proportion of them are sent on to the responsible officers, so the senior medical persons within organizations who are responsible for local fitness to practice, because they don't hit our thresholds for investigation, but we ask them to look at them and take remedial action. And then we investigate something like 2,000 plus per year, and we have different processes for doing that. So in answer to your question, the reason why we don't investigate more and don't send more to a tribunal is that they don't reach the various criteria we have, which is set in legislation. So we look at all cases that raise a question about doctors' fitness to practice. That's the first test. If it raises a question about fitness to practice, we then need to see if we can get the evidence, and or does the doctor present a risk. If there's disputes about evidence, as I've just said, that will go to a tribunal to resolve, so those cases end up there. And if the doctor doesn't have insight, is not taking steps to remediate, those will go to a tribunal. So we're about future risk, and that's again set out in our legislation. The test we apply is whether the doctor is fit to practice, not whether they were fit to practice, but are they going forward. So it really depends on what has happened post the actual event.
So if you take your 2018 numbers as you've supplied them to us, total inquiries or complaints, 8,573, 66% of which were from members of the public, 14% got to the stage of being investigated by a case examiner, and only 3% went to FTP.
The tribunal.
Yeah. And that's the main driver for it being only 3%. Is the main driver that it's inappropriate complaints, i.e. car parking or dentists rather than doctors, or is it?
So I wouldn't call them inappropriate complaints. There are complaints that don't meet our threshold. So they are concerns perhaps about doctors' communication style, which we think are better dealt with by the employer rather than the regulator, because we have quite blunt instruments for dealing with doctors. And so we're either going to issue a warning, advise, suspend, or put restrictions, which may seem disproportionate for a single complaint about communication.
Right.
So what we tend to get from patients is a whole vast array of complaints. It could be about care in general, not necessarily about a doctor, but about the treatment they received in hospital, and we would refer that on to the CQC or the hospital to deal with. What we do with employers, which is why when you look through the figures we tend to send more of those to a tribunal, is we have an employee liaison service, so senior members of the GMC talking to them about which concerns we need to deal with, which concerns should be dealt with locally. So we're moderating the complaints that come in from employers. So when we bring them in, they are serious complaints. They're about doctors who are a danger to patients. Those tend to go to tribunal. And I think what's interesting, if you look at the tribunal figures, you'll see that the hit rate, if you want to call it that, of suspension erasure is quite high. There are very few cases that we send to a tribunal that don't end up in some sort of order. And that, to me, suggests we're getting mostly right. But what I would say strongly is they're not inappropriate complaints. They're inappropriate for the GMC, but they're absolutely genuine concerns for employers and others to deal with.
And when you refer them to an employer, do you track and collect data on the outcomes?
We track them and we have the data. So the employee liaison advisors I've just described have conversations on a daily basis with the senior responsible officers in the trust across the 4 countries. And they're talking about complaints and managing complaints locally. They're talking about concerns that are arising, those that we're dealing with, those that are being dealt with locally. So those conversations are happening on a daily basis.
But it's not for you to satisfy yourselves as the GMC that the complaint was dealt with appropriately by the employer. It was, you just record the outcome, but you don't take a view on the outcome. Is that right?
We do more than record it, because obviously if we think that it's not being handled properly locally and there's still a risk to patients, then we will take action. So it's a bit more than just logging it. The conversations are real, and we're saying you need to deal with this because it's a problem. We don't think we need to step in, but if you fail to deal with it, then we will have to step in.
Right. And looking at GMC referrals and FTP cases as compared with NMC, there's a striking difference in terms of the percentage that result in impairment, sanction or striking off. In the NMC's case, data we've got most recently is 2014-15. That's over 5,000 total referrals, of which 26% resulted in impairment sanction or striking off, compared with, in the same year, I think 2.5% of GMC referrals. Is that surprising to you?
Not if you consider some of the factors at play. So we know for a fact that most of the nursing cases are not contested. Nurses walk away. They have no incentive to fight it. Doctors are quite litigious, and they do fight everything. So they're not represented. They might just walk away. They don't contest the hearings. So they will have a higher hit rate in terms of those that are struck off. Also, the types of conduct that are brought before the tribunals are slightly different. So we tend to have, by the very nature of what doctors do, a lot of clinical, technical concerns that patients may have. And we go through experts' reports, etc. The nursing don't. There's a lot of conduct style issue. So there's a lot of dishonesty and things like that. So I think when you break down the factors, you'll find that they're dealing with slightly different things.
Right.
I think the better analogy is if you look at midwives and the rate of strike-off of midwives. If you were to get that from an NMC, I think you'd see it was slightly different and more akin to what we do, because of course they do slightly different to your general nursing practitioner.
Can I just ask you, do you keep a sort of record of the names that keep coming up of surgeons or doctors who people are complaining against? Do you get a sort of absolutely a really monitoring exercise, and then when the same names keep on coming up, can you take action?
So we keep a record of all doctors who are registered and licensed, and one of the records we keep is around their fitness of practice, so how many complaints have reached us. So in a sense, yes, we do have a record of concerns that have been raised about every doctor, that we've logged, the action we've taken, conversations we've had with employers, etc., etc. And so if an example, if a particular doctor keeps coming up and they're in a trust, we would have a conversation with the responsible officer about what's going on, what needs to be done to try and get them on the right track, whether or not we need to be taking more firm action. Some doctors have restrictions that we've imposed, and we monitor those regularly to make sure they're complying with them, and they can last for years while we think the doctor's a risk. So, long answer, but yes, we do have it's not a single record, it's a database of all doctors within the UK and their fitness to practice history, which we do use to inform action.
So it takes quite a long time for you to record all that and then to actually take some action?
No, it's recorded as they come in. So the database has all the doctors, it has all the registration
I'm thinking
details.
about previous complaints, so that you've got a history of an individual whose name keeps coming up. And I thought you said it took you some time in order to take some action on that.
No. Forgive me if that was it. No, we have a database. It has all doctors on it.
Yeah.
If we get a complaint, that complaint's logged against the doctor.
Right.
So you're immediately building a picture. We're of course reliant on the information coming in or complaints, but as soon as it comes in, we're assessing that complaint, we're looking at the previous history and deciding what to do.
Right.
So it isn't the case that we have to wait for a package to do something.
I see.
So sorry, is that complaint logged on whether or not it goes through to fitness to practice?
Yes.
Whether it's not, it drops off at the investigation
Yes.
stage. And so the first inquiry that comes in, the first mention of that doctor, that will stay on that doctor's registered entry, and stays for a long time?
At the moment, although we've recently introduced a policy, it stays forever. But we have a policy now which has different timetables, and we can let you have this. So I think if we get an inquiry and it doesn't hit the first stage, I think it stays for 10 years. We keep a brief record of it, so we will know there has been a complaint, but we won't keep all the paperwork. So as soon as we get a complaint in, we log that, assess it.
Can I just, so it's on the question of multiple complaints about one individual, and I suppose we should be clear, we've certainly met plenty of people who coincidentally in the same meeting to us have named the same doctor as someone who they've been extremely distressed by or dissatisfied with, or both. If there are multiple complaints about a doctor over a reasonable time frame, not over many years, but say months, does that of itself trigger an investigation? The fact that there are multiple complaints rather than just one, even if the statutory threshold doesn't necessarily get hit?
It could do, but it will depend on what. So if I give you an example, we receive thousands of concerns about the doctors in those cases. we had to look at them, and we were not going to open a case just on that basis. We need to see what the complaints are about. We receive complaints about patients who can't access particular drugs that they want, not what they need. So the threshold is quite important because that's our statutory trigger. But if we got these complaints at the same time, we would open a case if they met that threshold. So I can't say we would disapply the threshold because we have to, because we do unfortunately get lots of little complaints which are not necessarily about doctors' fitness to practice. The doctor could be doing the right thing, for example, not doling out drugs that shouldn't be doled out, and a group of patients would complain about that practice. So we would look at what they were complaining about, not necessarily the number. The number would be a trigger, and it might be a trigger to have a conversation with the responsible officer to say, you may need to find out what's going on down there. We don't think we need to act just yet because it hasn't hit our threshold. Obviously, if it was something more serious and patients have been harmed, a single complaint would trigger our action.
So a group of patients complaining about a doctor's dismissive attitude
would be something for us to look at, because we do talk about communications as one of the things we look at. So yes, that would be something, because that could lead to other risks to patients.
Right, I think perhaps Cyril, do you?
Can we move on?
Yeah.
One of the issues that's arisen over the last years is the notion of accrediting on the register for subspecialities, and I believe the GMC has or is considering that, and but it's quite complicated. When the President of the Royal College of Surgeons came to talk to us, he made an interesting point that about the complexity of recording, validating an individual, because sometimes even within a specialty, say paediatric urology, there are issues about which operation and what, and that he felt the current thinking, because no decision has been made, is that it's probably better to accredit the units and then accredit the person who works in that unit as competent to do what that unit is accredited to do. So you may have, say, 2 centres in the country doing one particular operation. Do I make myself clear?
Yes, no.
And do you have a view?
It is complicated. So we are in the. We've had conversations with quite a lot of people, and obviously Derek Alderson was one of those. It is trying to get the right balance as to how you subdivide doctors and at what level of granularity, and how important it is to have that recorded at a regulatory level as opposed to, for example, as an organisation or an employer level. So we have not reached a firm view just yet. We're still contemplating how we might take that forward. Our sense is that going to that level of detail would create an enormous amount of burden in terms of trying to administer, because if you've even got 1 or 2 people, you've got to have a similar process, whether you've got 1 or 2 or more. I think there's potentially, and I don't know if I'm making a link that we're not ready to make, but I was just thinking in terms of the conflicts of interest part of this, and how it is that a doctor declares his role in delivering a treatment. So how does an organisation decide when they've got a new treatment technique or device whether or not they should adopt that, and what the evidence for introducing it might be, and what conflicts the person proposing it might have. So something around the governance that sits within an organisation around that might be helpful.
Well, yes, that's interesting, because actually that was the preliminary question to what I now want to move on to, which is actually a big issue that's come up as we've met people across the country, and that is potential conflicts of interest of people who may be doing things or using materials or devices with a conflict as to between the person who's provided that device and the best interest of the patient.
Yeah.
So you'll understand where I'm going.
Mm-hmm.
So it has been suggested, and I know you've carried out a consultation, that the General Medical Council on the medical register should record a register of interest, not conflicts of interest, a register of interest, just as parliamentarians have to do so, and that is very much for the protection of the public. Now, in the evidence you gave us, you say that doctors are expected to declare a conflict of interest, and that's been in good medical practice for many years. But you say you take the breach of very seriously, and action ranges from warning a doctor to removing a doctor from the medical register for a breach of that. Have you an example of a doctor who has been removed? Because when I looked at the case studies you gave, they seem to basically seem to refer to people who weren't registered medical practitioners. They were osteopaths or acupuncturists. So do you have an example of any doctor who has been removed from the register for failing to declare a conflict of interest?
Not to hand, but I can get you that information. I'm pretty sure we have taken action. It won't be for a single...
No.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure we can get that information.
Yes, but I think that would be help you do. So moving on, when you did the consultation, because in the evidence you've given us, you support the idea of a register, as I see it, but you say it wouldn't be appropriate necessarily for the GMC to hold it, and you would expect it to apply to all healthcare workers. Is that a reasonable summary of where you are?
I'm going to ask Anthony. The reason I'm kind of slightly batting this to Anthony is that when that consultation was carried out, I wasn't in the GMC, so some of those conversations and I wasn't around, so I hope you don't mind.
But looking at the evidence you sent, does that seem to me that what you're saying was that you think it's an interesting thing, you're not against it, but you don't think the GMC should hold it, perhaps ought to be held by somebody else, and it should apply to all healthcare professionals?
So I think in general terms, yes. I think what we're trying to say is a single register held by the GMC is part of the solution. It will provide transparency, but it won't necessarily solve the problem if you don't have employers monitoring and managing at a local level. So if I take my employer, I have to declare my interest on the website. My employer requests returns from me every time there's a regular process for doing. They check and monitor that. So we have no objection to a register wherever it is held, be that GMC others. I think we say that should be part of a process where employers and others, and
yes.
If you take the independent sector, those organizations are responsible for maintaining, getting things on, monitoring, managing, reporting to us, and then the action, and then you have that package of things, and that should all be transparent and available to patients. So I think that's the gloss I would put on that.
Yes. Now, so when you look at the outcome of the consultation in 2016, you say the majority of respondents were against it. But the majority of the respondents, by a long way, were members of the profession. The number of individual members of the public who responded was very small, and the majority of them were in favour of it. So it does seem to me that given the main responsibility of the General Medical Council as set out in the 1983 Act is the protection of the public, then maybe the views of the public should carry more weight than the views of the profession in this instance.
I would not disagree with you. I think that consultation landed at the time when the profession was in a particularly unhappy place. It was more about the register we hold and trying to make that more useful. It wasn't specifically about conflicts or register of conflicts, although it was about enhancing the register. As I said, I completely agree with you. I think where we are now is to say we would support the idea of more transparency around interest and conflicts of interest. We would support a mechanism that involved employers and organizations who are first-line defense, in a sense, managing and monitoring that with regulatory oversight.
But given that the Act exists right back to the 19th century to tell the public who is a registered medical practitioner, given the register exists, shouldn't that information be available to the public directly? I mean, it is, and you've said you want to make it more useful.
It should. I mean, the slight wrinkle is that what goes on the register is in legislation. So if we want to add things on, it can only be done on a voluntary basis. Unless there was
it can be done by
legislation.
secondary legislation,
Yes.
I think.
So if we had legislation, we would.
You could do it through secondary legislation.
We could, but that still requires a department.
Yes,
It's not.
but if you asked for it, would you be prepared to ask that there should be a register of the interests, and actually, I put it to you, it could be quite positive that you, not only saying these are my interests, which I must declare as I would on Disclosure UK, but you could also say what the individual's professional, clinical interest is, which might be helpful to the doctor as well as very helpful to patients. And it would get back to what we were talking about, accreditation, validation, and subspecialty interests. Couldn't you bring all those together to produce a register which is more useful to the public?
The short answer, yes. I think if the review were to say to the department, because we already have several wish lists in with the department that this is a priority, then we would be happily backing that, as I said.
So in principle, I know I'm leaving, I'm sorry, but in principle, you wouldn't be opposed to considering that the General Medical Council should enhance its register.
Absolutely not.
To record interests.
Absolutely not. We would be behind that.
So would you consider taking this further and employing lawyers to draw up the secondary legislation so that you could just present it to Parliament, because you could do it through a private member's bill, you could do it through various other mechanisms. But people need the information and they need the legal language in order to do it, and I presume you employ a lot of lawyers for various reasons. So if you were to do that, then we would at least start it rolling, as it were.
So that may be a step slightly too far for me to commit the chairmanship to at this stage, but I can take that back and get, because this is a decision our council will have to make. I can't make that decision. So I can say that where the organisation is we fully support that idea and principle. How we then try and achieve it, I would need some of my paymasters to agree to that. But I'm more than happy to take that suggestion back.
Right. Because we feel that actually it would maintain and enhance public confidence. And I just think of the register that I have to update every month, every 2 months or so on, when the House is not sitting in the House of Lords. And we have to declare all our interests. And they may not be conflicts of interest. And I think Cyril's point's a very good one, that actually it would not only enhance public confidence, but it would actually ensure that the public would have access to a single source that they could interrogate. I think what you were saying, Stoma, on the question that it's about employers as well, and I can absolutely understand that, but that is more difficult for people. Whereas if you have a general register, then they can interrogate that for the particular purpose that they are seeking to find answers to.
Okay, I will certainly take that back.
Yeah, right.
We have discussed that, and so the issue of understanding is really important. I'm not disputing that at all. I was trying to work out in my own mind the extent to which a national register would entirely achieve. So we're not opposed to it, as we've said, but so if I can just use my own personal experience as a clinician employed in the NHS, I have memberships of a number of professional societies. Question would be, in a clinical role working for the NHS, they're not conflicts of interest, they're necessary to do the job. I now move into the GMC, I still hold those professional memberships. They are declared on the website and they are now conflicts of interest. So there is this slight challenge about the contextualisation of a conflict of interest and how that is overseen, I think, in my mind. So if it was a register of interest, and I guess you can choose what you put on it, but does it then mean that if you've not put something, so we make it clear that if you think it's a potential conflict, you should declare it. but there's always the question then about the threshold, I guess, in my mind, and the role of the employer and the organisations, whether they're NHS or independent sector, in also knowing what is relevant to the person's employment across all the professions. It was just...
There is already guidance in the National Health Service on managing conflicts of interest, which was published recently, which you'll have seen, and indeed the General Medical Council participated in the consultation about it. But we're talking here, beyond that, to the whole of the healthcare system in this country, private as well as public. And we're not suggesting that you should perceive what the conflicts are for a register. We want a register of interests. And I would expect the GMC to issue guidance about it. But on this register, you'd expect it to be, if in doubt, more comprehensive. And the guidance that the parliamentarians have to follow seems, at least at first sight, be relevant for you to consider when you give advice about that.
Yes, can I just give an example? I mean, in my register, I always put that I am actually a trustee of a private school. And I don't see that as being a problem with the public or anything like that. But I think if people see, oh, she's got an interest in education, then we ought to discuss this with her or whatever. And I think it actually enhances the whole debate that you can have, and certainly for people who are going to have an operation, they may not want to go to their local area. They may want to go to somewhere quite different. And we feel that, I feel, we haven't come out with our recommendations yet, but when the medical profession are being supported by the industry in their research and all that sort of thing, we ought to know about that. So I think it's got, as Cyril was saying, it's got actually a much wider remit that would help patients, would help indeed clinicians. And I think it is part of the open, transparent honesty that we are trying to establish in all sorts of areas.
Yes, forgive me, I wasn't challenging whether there should be. I was trying to think through whether it would solve the problem, I guess, rather than... So you can have the register of interest, but that does then require that other people use it in a way that helps them solve the problem. So that was all I was kind of trying to think through in my own mind, and trying to help people to understand what would count seems also quite important. I mean, I was just conversationally observing, I can't recall, to my fairly certain knowledge, at any time during my NHS clinical career being asked whether I had any conflicts of interest. But when I moved into academia and into the GMC, in both cases, a regular recurrent registration of conflicts, or declaration of conflicts. And mine are all published, including things that I think may not be important, but are there for people to say. So I am, please understand, I am not disputing the intention. I was trying to just think through whether it would assist at the front line in helping to...
You made a very interesting point, Professor Melville, because I've been through exactly the same. And it struck me as odd that the requirements for me to declare through my academic life have been more than through my health service. And that seems to be bizarre.
But it was your employer, the university, not a national body. And that's
indeed it was, and you can't, as you and I know, stand up and present something without it should be absolutely clear about that. But given the function of the medical register is to protect the public, given that it can be done, because it's done in other areas, surely this is something we should really go back and look at again.
Well, as Anthony said, we will certainly take it back to our council, but unfortunately it's not within our gift
we understand
to accede to that here today.
This is a conversation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In terms sort of back on that theme of trust and trust in the profession, it is very interesting what you said, that one of the professions that we regard as certainly one of our most trusted professions has never had anything like that. But there have been some incidents that have certainly dented and damaged trust in the medical profession recently. What are you as an organisation doing to sort of look at that potential repair?
I mean, I think you've sort of set out, it's not the profession as a whole. What we're facing is a number of individuals for whom clearly a number, maybe quite a large number from the way you've been speaking, of patients who've had a very bad experience, and that is clearly not satisfactory. The dilemma for us as a regulator is, so we can provide guidance that sets out what we think is good practice, but we're not there on the front line daily inspecting how that happens. And as Anthony has already referred to, unfortunately, we're only in a position to take action if we're alerted to there being a problem. We do work, as Anthony has said, with the employment liaison advisors to try and understand more locally, so to intervene at an earlier stage to try and avoid things becoming serious. And clearly there is always more work to do in the sense of the trust with the public. But as we've already said, that is first and foremost our raison d'etre.
I think it's reasonable for us to put on record in relation to this conversation, because it is being recorded, that we do acknowledge the changes that have taken place over the last years in accreditation and revalidation. Every employer has a responsible officer which you're in contact with the regulator all the time. So there isn't one single process which can improve the confidence and trust, which of course is so vital, because so much of what doctors do is about conscience as well as contract. And so how that works together, and I think much has taken place since I was on the General Medical Council to actually take that forward. So I think we should acknowledge that.
Just a couple of things we are doing with patients is we've made it much easier for complaints to be made. So you may or may not know this. You may know this, but back in 2002 you had to swear an affidavit to make a complaint to the GMC. We now accept complaints by email, phone, anonymously, or online. We also have a patient liaison team that helps complainants through our process. And often what we find, which is probably what you're finding, is patients have been round the system, no one's listened. This is the first time they've actually had someone tell their story. Now, whether we can take it forward is a different matter, but at least we've given them the opportunity to tell us, and we can act on the system. We can push the buttons in the system that they've not been able to push. So there are things we're doing. We're looking at appointing, because we do struggle to engage with patients at large. You have campaign groups and they have their topics. We're looking to appoint a senior person as a sort of a patient czar, somebody who can take that on so we can get better engagement with patients. So we're doing quite a bit to try and engage patients in as much as we're engaging the profession in this, because it's got to be a joint effort.
Do you think that patients struggle to find you, or do you think that they just don't? No.
Not with the volume of complaints we receive. As I said, and when we started, the 6,000 we get, which are not about us or doctors, show us that there's no struggle. If you Google complain about a doctor, we're number 2 or number 3 on the search. Trusts don't come up, others don't come up, but the GMC does come up, and that's fine in a sense, but they're coming to the wrong place in a lot of cases. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but there's no way patients are finding it difficult to get hold of us.
But is it navigating the system?
But navigating the system and trying to get at the heart of what has happened, why a loved one has been harmed, that remains quite a challenge.
Can I say, we've spoken to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of patients now, and what has come up very clearly is just what you were saying, that they have to fight so hard to be heard. And you mentioned your patient czar, and I presume that is an internal appointment to the GMC. Can you help us in any way to think about how we can ensure, in a much wider sense, beyond the GMC, how we can actually ensure that patients are taken seriously, that their comments are responded to, and that at least someone is listening. Can you think of, beyond your czar, what else we could do as a nation?
So we think it has to be within the institutions where the concern occurs. So we now have senior doctors, responsible officers, but their reach is limited to doctors, for example. So one of the things we think, and we've said this in response to the Patterson inquiry, is having a member of the board who is responsible for seeing that complaints are heard, that complainants are heard. And some trusts do have this. We've seen this in some trusts. Not all. It's not uniform. But we think a uniform system where a senior person who has the pull to get things done and heard is responsible for complaint handling. Not left to this junior officer who probably has 1,000 of them to deal with and can't get the doctors or the other professions to respond, but a senior member of the board whose role is to say, every month, every 6 months, well, these are the complaints we've had, this is what we've done, this is what we're dealing with, this is how we're doing it, and can push the things that need to be pushed within these very large organizations. So that patients know if you're unhappy, this is where you go. It's quite difficult in general practice to go back to the practice and complain about the GP who you'll have to see the next week. So again, what is a mechanism outside that where you can complain and have that heard and dealt with? We think responsible officers have a role in that. The commissioners have a role in that. If they set the contract in such a way that, and I'm making part of this up so Colin will jump in, but if they set the contracts when they commission services that it has a complaints process that is simple and easy to understand, that does not involve you having to talk to the person you're complaining about, that will go some way to helping patients being heard. But again, having that, I think without that senior person check and balance, looking down the track and saying, okay, what are we doing about that? Are we taking it seriously? A lot of trusts, as I said, do this, and if complaints are escalated up to the board. Most don't. So board members are oblivious to what is going on below the financial line and the other pressures they have to deal with, and that's not to suggest that they don't have a lot to do. But I think it is so serious, it is so important. We hear this time and time again, and until something like that happens, I think we'll continue to have it where patients are being lost in the system and looking for who to complain with. We think we get a lot of the complaints because they haven't got anywhere in the system. Unfortunately, it's 2, 3, 4 years down the line, and our ability to take action is quite limited at that stage. So I think certainly having that senior person on the board who is responsible for complaints, complaint handling, having a streamlined process has got to be a start.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful. I think I'm going to just ask my colleagues if they've got any more questions.
One final question. On the question of timing and sort of latencies, a lot of the interventions we hear about have very long latencies from the sort of point of treatment to the point of somebody realising there's an issue and complaining. And as you said, you get things in quite a long time after the event often. How does your 5-year rule work and apply in these cases?
So the 5-year rule essentially says if it's more than 5 years old after the event, it shouldn't be investigated unless it's in the public interest. And we interpret public interest quite low. So if it's a serious harm that's been done and the patient has struggled around the system, then we will look at that.
So have you got any questions for us?
No, I don't.
No, I wondered if I could just add an addendum to what Anthony said. I was very struck by a paper actually authored by Michael West from the King's Fund called Caring for Change. It seemed to go largely unnoticed, and in that he talked about compassionate leadership. And your question about how can patients be heard is mostly, in my mind, it's about trying to understand their perspective. We're very good at defending our position. We're not always very good at understanding the other person's perspective. And in his 4 steps of compassionate leadership, one of those things is actually called understanding, but it is about understanding their perspective. And I do think we've potentially lost something in the way in which we practice now, that we're not very good at getting inside the mind, inside the shoes of the patient. Since I left clinical practice, I've been approached by several people who just said, "Can I ask your advice?" And it's nearly always, "I don't know what to do. When I ask this person in the hospital, they can't help me." And so it's helping to navigate people through those processes And actually, one of those resulted in a very productive conversation. I said, well, it feels to me as if this is what you need to ask. Go and ask those questions and try and get some. And they came back and said that was really helpful. So I think some of this is about trying to understand the patient's perspective. It is a heart issue, not a mind issue, and we haven't quite got that right.
Well, thank you very much for that. This is what comes of inviting a professor to come and give us information.
I'm not gonna
It's
live that
really
down.
very useful. Thank you. Thank you both very much.